I've got a 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor of a killdeer to share with you today. Killdeer are pretty common birds, but for some reason it took me a long time to get around to painting one. Since I didn't have a real background, I could skip the whole frisket process and dive right into the painting. That was a fun change of pace. I transferred my sketch to the watercolor paper using tracing paper. A link to that process is in the video description. The cold press paper was a bit harder to get a clean transfer on, but it worked fine in the end. I started by blocking in the bird's back and some of the greenish grasses of the background using a number 4 round brush. The killdeer's back was painted with burnt sienna, darkened up a bit with ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. The greens were a mix of phthalo green, lemon yellow, desaturated with chrome orange, a little burnt sienna, or cadmium red. In shaded areas, I brought in some ultramarine blue. I pretty quickly switched over to a number 2 round brush since, in the absence of a background, the painting was mostly detail fading off the page. For the blacks of the killdeer, I used some purplish grays made with dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, and some burnt sienna. Those are the same colors for the bird's brown colors, but in different proportions. I basically hopped around the page trying to build up my detail more or less evenly as you move horizontally through the page. The composition on this was super straightforward with only 2 main areas of interest, the bird and the nest. To avoid a ping-pong effect that's problematic if you have 2 main interest points, I ended up adding in some other elements. I put in some curved twigs on either side to pull the eye back into the page and clumped up some of the low foliage on the ground to create some additional areas of focus. I brought in a little more chrome orange and yellow ochre to the head and the tuft of the tail of the bird. In the photo of reference, it was really hard to separate out the tail from the killdeer's back and the top of its head. I ended up switching up the colors of each area to make them a little different, but kept the values similar, which hopefully added to the appearance of separation, even if I gave up a tiny bit of realism. I think it still read accurately to the species in the end, despite pushing the colors a bit. After all, it's a painting, not a field guide illustration. This one's a bit different than most of my paintings. While I usually use hot press paper, I did this one on a block of 9 by 12 inch Kilimanjaro cold press paper that someone had given me a few years ago. Normally, I'd be very reluctant to change up papers. I've been using Arches 140-pound hot press paper for over 25 years, and I love its super smooth surface and have gotten used to its subtle downsides, like being fussy about taking a wash. On this painting, I was planning on doing a few things out of my normal comfort zone, so it was probably not a bad time to try out this new paper. I'd also been doing a lot of pen and ink cartoons on cold press paper recently, so it was a little less intimidating. On this painting, I was planning on working on a white background. I almost never work on white because I find the art to look pretty boring. Finished work can look like spot illustrations. In art school, you just didn't bring any art on a white background unless you wanted a good roasting in a critique. Anymore, if I do go with white as a background, I want it to be a very conscious choice. In this case, my photo reference had really low depth of field and fairly limited colors. I thought that I could fade to white around the bird and the eggs. Killdeer have pretty muted colors, so it would be fun to keep things less saturated on this painting. In general, I tend to go for really saturated colors, so this was going to be an exercise in restraint. As you can see from the palette, I used a pretty limited color selection on this painting. I really tried to hold off on using intense saturated greens, instead going with options that were more muted. I think given the color subtlety of the killdeer, it made sense not to draw too much attention away from the bird with a lot of bright greens. One of the worries I had with this painting was how to render the nest and the eggs. In reality, those eggs all but disappear to the eye. They're super camouflaged and you could easily step on them and never even know they were there. I choose to take some liberties and separate them from the background by darkening around them. This would help them show up, but compared to the high contrast black and white of the killdeer, they should definitely take a back seat in the composition. One of my favorite parts in painting the killdeer was that fun orangey red eye ring. I mean, come on, how cool is that? Killdeer are plovers, which are wading birds. I've only painted 3 or 4 types of plovers over the years, and every time I've done one, I always think that head is a funny shape. I can't decide if it looks like a golf club driver head or an inverted trapezoid. It's a little wider on the top around the eyes than I always expect, and I'm assuming it's an adaptation to see predators approaching, but that's just a guess. They're definitely different than the warblers and other birds I'm typically painting, but lots of fun to work on. So after spending a bit of time working on this Kilimanjaro paper, I'd say that so far I like it. It's definitely bumpier than hot press Arches paper that I typically use, but it doesn't seem to get in the way of all the detail like a rough watercolor paper might. One thing I'm not crazy about is that the bumps show up when you scan it. That doesn't happen with hot press paper. I need to give it a shot with a more rendered background where it should really excel in taking a smooth wash. I really like the paper, and given the fact that it's about 2/3 the price of Arches, yet still is 100% cotton rag and is acid free, that's great. You can't really go wrong with it if you're looking for a nice bright white 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. They don't seem to make Kilimanjaro paper in hot press, at least in the watercolor blocks that I like to use. I'd definitely like to try it if it were an option. For now, I'll use up this pad and move back to the Arches hot press paper later. Well, thanks for watching. This was a fun, quick painting to work on. Now I finally have a Killdeer painting. I hope you get the chance to get in some watercolor painting soon.